Hi guys, welcome to the archive. So this week my patrons voted for me to build, among other things, some Warcamp scatter terrain, and when I thought about it that kind of made sense. Player characters are constantly stumbling ass backwards into enemy camps. That's when they're not actively planning to infiltrate enemy camps, or just failing really badly at war diplomacy. It also makes a lot of sense for wargaming. Your army can be encamped pretty much anywhere, and having a few of these scattered in your deployment zone kind of gives the impression that your army was caught off guard and you're fighting a defensive battle. There are 3 different tutorials in this video, the first of which are these weapon racks. I wanted them to be easy enough to make without having a stockpile of old weapons from old minis to make. I wanted everything to be handcrafted from things you can just get your hands on really easily. I didn't want any barriers to entry, and I wanted new people to the hobby to be able to jump right in. The first step was to make a framework out of balsa wood. The best way that I've found personally to make small pieces of scatter like this look realistic, to me at least, is to keep the piece small and thin. Remember that every piece you use is going to be used next to minis, and should probably be scaled appropriately. If the piece of material you are going to use for the sides of a small weapon rack is about as thick as a mini's whole chest, it's possible it might be a tad oversized. With that in mind, I mostly used 1/8 of an inch thick balsa for this, a mix of square strips and 1/16 of an inch thick flat strips. I used a few pieces of 3/16 of an inch wide strips as well, mainly to add some variety to the piece. I wire brushed the hell out of this before I cut them to deepen the wood grain, just because it's easier to do that way. Don't forget to wear a dust mask while doing this, no matter how sick of face masks you may feel at the moment. I started by cutting 2 1-inch long square strips for the tall sides of the spear racks, and 2 strips of 1-inch long 3/16 of an inch wide strips for the feet. In the video here you see me cutting 1.5-inch long side strips that I was going to use to make the rack taller, but I decided to cut these down shorter later. I cut out 2 more 1/8 of an inch square strips at 1/2 inch long, and cut down the ends by 45 degrees so I could glue them in place supporting the tall piece at a nice 45-degree angle, and then tacky glued them all together. That gave me the core of each piece, and from there I cut out a strip of 3/16 of an inch flat balsa, making sure it was smooth 90 degrees on the ends, and glued it to each side in the centre. Once I had that, I cut 1/8 of an inch thin strips for just above the angled supports on both sides, cutting off any excess, which is a lot easier than precisely measuring it. Finally, I added 1 more 3/16 of an inch wide strip at the top, this time on one side only. Initially, I thought about drilling holes straight through this piece and adding wire that could be used as pegs to make it look like the swords were hung on, and like they were keeping spears straight on the other side. This was a complete pain in the backside though, so I scrapped it and ended up just gluing small chunks of cocktail stick on after gluing the weapons in place. And that's the rack pretty much done. Now for the weapons. You can of course use pieces left over from minis if you have them, but I wanted some techniques that I could use to make as many of each thing as I wanted. For both the swords and the spears I used the teeth from a comb as the blades. And for the sword's pommel I used the bobbly teeth of a hairbrush. This was a nice, quick and easy way to get authentic looking blade and pommel shapes with absolutely minimal effort. I found that a pocket comb was okay for the spears, but for longer sword blades, I found that I was better off with a full-size comb. To add to this for the swords, I cut a hilt for each one from 1mm thick plasticard. If you can get 2mm thick plasticard here, it would probably work a little bit better, but I had 1mm lying around, so I just used that. For the spears I did a similar thing. I used cocktail sticks for the shafts and added a smaller hilt for the blade, using a small cross section of Q-tip, which are ever so slightly thicker than cocktail sticks. For the blade I cut a smaller tooth from a pocket comb, and cut 2 45-degree chunks from the bottom to make it less flat and obvious before supergluing it on top. I kind of regret not cutting these chunks from the bottom of my sword blades, so feel free to learn from my mistakes and make yours look better. Finally, I grabbed some of those little diddy beads that I used in the magnetic bar and cupboards build to superglue onto the bottom and make a nice end for the spear. You could also use the techniques that I showed when making the bottle corks for the magnetic table and accessories video to etch in some interesting designs into the spears, though obviously this takes a while and depends on how much you value the end result. As you can see, I didn't bother. You could though, and I think it would look awesome. Finally, to make painting as easy as possible, I painted the spears separately, though the swords I glued in place first because I just found that easier. I painted them pretty much the same way I would as a mini's weapons. At the same time, I painted the weapon rack using a wash of army paint to soft tone. This is a wood painting technique I'm experimenting with that works quite well on balsa wood and other real wood, but less so on foam. I quite like the finish and it is very easy to do, but I haven't decided if I'll paint more things in this style going forwards. I'm curious to know what you guys think about it, so leave a comment if you've got an opinion. Once both were dry, I superglued the spears in place and added the cocktail stick pegs, which also got a soft tone wash to finish the job. If you like this video and want to see more, go quickly hit subscribe and the bell to catch me in future. For the second build, I wanted to do some archery targets, because these kind of training pieces make excellent scatter in war camps, but they also don't look out of place in most castles or courtyards of military buildings, as well as even in a village as part of an archery contest as part of a village fair, or just practice for the local peasants. They also make an interesting room you can add to a dungeon, a training room where the monsters practice to make sure that they're not completely incompetent by the time the adventurers actually show up. Plus, they are really quick to make and look awesome for kind of minimal effort, and I'm all about that when I can be. Making them was pretty straightforward. The first step was wrapping string in a coil. I found the easiest way to do this was to superglue the tip of the string bent onto itself as tightly as I could. And from there, pinch it in between my finger and thumb and wind the string around in a circle. Once it was a decent size, I found I could lay it flat on the desk and continue. I kept wrapping until it fit just about inside a 1-inch square, which was a nice easy way of making sure that all of the targets were roughly the same size. Once I reached the right size, I cut off the excess and spread gel superglue across the whole thing. This piece is going to be the back of the target, so this superglue bit will be in the middle. Once that was dry, I superglued a fresh piece of string to the middle and laid out some fresh superglue around it and then wound the string around, gluing it down as I went. By the end, I had a solid as hell target which was nice and unglued on the outside, which made it easier to get a nice finish on because it really didn't need painting other than the red splotch in the middle. I then made a stand for them using some cocktail sticks that I cut to 2 inches long. I also trimmed the edges of these with a knife to give them a rough hewn look. I superglued these together and then wrapped string around the joints to make them appear like they'd been tied together. I found the best way to glue them like this was to blue tack the feet down on my cutting board about 1 inch apart to keep them in place, and then glue the tops in place in the centre with a little bit crossing over. Once dry, I could then add the third stick with its foot 1 inch away behind them. And then finally I added a 4th stick, 1 inch long, to the bottom at a height that basically just allows the target to sit on the top nicely. Before anything else, I gave the whole piece a wash of strong tone black-brown wash. Like I said, I'm basically experimenting with these. I'm not sure which I prefer, or if I prefer dry brushing and paint. Like I say, if you have a favourite between these, let me know in the comments. The next step was just to strip a piece of string down to its smaller constituent bits of string, and use them to tie around the glued areas before tying them in a knot and cutting the excess string off. I also stained these with some heavily watered down soft tone wash, just to make them a little bit less bright. I realised while doing this you can do the same thing with any spare spears to make some alternative improvised weapon stacks, which also make nice scatter in pretty much any vaguely militarised environment. Finally, I superglued the target in place and painted a small red circle in the centre, and that was that, pretty much done. The final piece I wanted to make are these defensive spikes. And again, I wanted to be able to make these completely from scratch without having leftover bits from minis or anything like that. Something you can make just from materials you can get your hands on really easily. I also wanted them to be modular, so I made them 3 inches wide so they would match up with my modular tiles, with my wall systems and all that kind of stuff. but it's also a good size to use them independently and just put them next to each other like that. What's cool about this is if you have some of Blackmagicraft's tiles, much like my tiles, these will be compatible with it. The guy's popular, and rightly so. I started with a chunk of 3" by 2" by 1" XPS foam, which I cut down to look like a mound of piled earth. I kept the centre roughly 1 inch tall to give the piece some height and stability. I also cut the very top of the earthworks to be slightly flattened, so it would be possible to stand minis up there, or at least that was the plan. From here I needed some materials for the spikes themselves. I used some fallen sticks from trees that I gathered from near my house, which I sterilised in the oven before shaving the bark off and sharpening the end, cutting the piece down to about 3 inches long. The sticks I used were all about 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch in diameter, which seemed about the right thickness for the scale. I also wire brushed the pieces to add some deeper grains for the wash to catch later. I find a good way to cut thicker sticks like this without using a saw or risking it fracturing when snapping is to shave down chunks at a time, which you can then cut off like this. Once I had those, I took my foam and drilled some guide holes using a thick-ish drill bit at the angle that I wanted, which was roughly 30 degrees or so. I found that 45 degrees was a bit too high. I drilled these in roughly 1 inch apart. With the guide holes in place, I wedged my spikes in to make sure they'd fit nicely. I used the sharp end first here to widen the hole a little, which really helped let the rough end just slide in. Before gluing them in, I laid the foam on top of some chipboard and cut around it roughly. I did this roughly so I could tacky glue the pieces together and then trim the card edges right up to the foam at a sloped angle, which would be nicely hidden under the texture later. Once cut, I tacky glued the piece together, and once dried, I trimmed the card until it lined up with the foam at that nice sloped angle. Attaching the card also helped add more weight to the base and keeps it upright even if it gets knocked. At this point I hot glued the spikes in place. Before going any further, I gave the spikes a wash of Army Paint a Strong Tone, which is a dark brown wash. This was going to be a ton easier to do at this stage rather than later. Then I got to work adding some ground texture to the earthworks. I knew that I didn't want any tufts or flock on the base because I wanted it to look like freshly turned earth. Unfortunately, I was out of Sculptamold and my delivery wasn't due for nearly a month. Yes, seriously. To get around this, I mixed up an alternative ground texture / compound from wall filler, Mod Podge, fine sand and brown craft paint. I mixed in a ratio of 1 part Mod Podge to 2 parts filler and 2 parts fine sand, and then added brown paint until I was happy with the result. As you can see, I went through a fair amount of experimentation here. Before I added this to the earthworks though, I used some balled up tin foil to add some undulations to the foam underneath, giving it a less perfectly rounded shape to lay the gunk over. Once mixed, I applied this all over the earthworks, aiming to fluff it up to look like uneven packed mud, for which Sculptamold would have been perfect. I started just laying it on, keeping it about 5mm thick to make sure that it didn't crack. I made sure it covered all the areas I wanted, and at first decided I was going to do it in 2 parts, the front and the back, so I wouldn't accidentally put my foot, or more importantly my finger, in it. Partway through I decided to do all of the pieces at once though, to make sure the colour of each piece was consistent if I needed to mix up more gunk. Once I had that nice thickness, including in areas that I pushed a dip in the foam into, which are easy to miss, I started dabbing the gunk gently, pulling it around almost like random ripples in water, though being careful to try and keep any shapes that I made blobs rather than smooth lines, curves or points, where the gunk stuck to my sculpting tool. This was challenging, but pretty easy once I got the hang of it. Finally, I made sure there were no gravity-defying bits of mud at the bottom of the piece, and that it all lined up nicely with the ground, and laid it back down, before quickly deciding some non-stick parchment paper was probably a good idea. When it dried, disaster struck, and despite keeping the layers quite thin, almost all of the pieces cracked. This was a massive shame. Aside from meaning the pieces needed to be rescued, I actually really liked the compacted mud effect that the gun could create. Aside from the cracks, it was perfect. Also, that should be on a t-shirt. Luckily for me, the same day I got my delivery from Geek Gaming Scenics, which is Luke's APS's basing materials shop if you hadn't come across it. It happened to have some nice ground cover basing material in the form of this forest path mix, which honestly I think looks really nice as freshly turned dry earth. I waited until after the next stage was complete to rescue the mud, but I was fairly confident I could bring it back from Project Death at this point. So, gutting failures aside, I started work on the chains that I wanted to string between the spikes. The idea with these was to provide an obstacle for infantry while the spikes stopped cavalry and monsters. To start with, I used some cereal card cut down to 1/4 of an inch thick and wrapped it around each spike about halfway from the tip, supergluing it in place. To make sure it had a nice smooth curve to it, I wrapped it around a large brush first, just enough to make sure it didn't fold rather than curve when putting it in place. Then it was just a matter of stringing up jewellery chain between them and supergluing it in place. I sprayed this chain with metallic paint first. This is a lot easier than trying to paint it once it's already attached. Once this was dry, I cut the chain down to about the right size to hang between the gaps, which for me was about 10 links long, and superglued it to the cereal card. You can also add some little extras at this point, like hanging heads or skulls threaded into the chain. I chose not to, mainly so that I could use these pieces for as many factions as possible without it looking completely out of place. Tweezers are incredibly helpful for this bit. I gave the cereal card a coat of Mod Podge and black paint to seal it, and then fill out some more detail. I added some more Mod Podge, dabbed on with a cocktail stick to make bolts on each side. Then I just painted the cereal card with gunmetal and gave it and the chain a black wash, letting some pool around the bolts to add some depth. Once the chains were done, it was time to backtrack and fix the horrible cracking. Never again will I not stockpile hobby materials like some kind of crazed doomsday prepper. Fixing it was pretty straightforward though. I coated each piece in a decent layer of PVA. I made sure my ground cover was well mixed up so it didn't end up with mostly stones, and then sprinkled it on. I didn't let any larger stones leave my fingers here because I thought that they would stick out too far on the steep slopes to look realistic. Once I gave the whole thing a good covering while being horribly awkward on camera, I added some more over any of the areas that still showed glue and patted them down gently before shaking off the excess. I also sprinkled some over the spikes near the dirt to give them a bit of weathering. Finally, I sealed the ground cover with some sealant that I made from a 50-50 mix of PVA and acrylic matte medium, which is the same stuff I used to make my wash in my painting stone video, and then watered it down thoroughly. I dripped this on using a pipette, but if you don't have one of these, you could just use a big brush and squeeze it with your fingers. It's messier and less controlled, but it should get the job done. I gave the pieces one last blast of matte varnish to seal in anything that got missed, and called it done. I think all the pieces turned out pretty well, and most were pretty easy to put together. Using spare weapons from minis would definitely be easier for the weapon racks, but I'm honestly glad that I went this route because I know I can make as many as I need even if I run out of bits, and it helps people who don't have any just lying around. The archery targets are possibly my favourite. They add so much atmosphere and they look great with what was very little effort, especially on painting. And after the rescue job, courtesy of Luke's ground cover, I'm pretty happy with how the spikes turned out too. I love how the earth tones just blend with the spikes to draw the piece together. The last piece was one of those pieces that could have gone horribly wrong, but in the end I think the rescue actually looks better than the original. I am actually a really big fan of Luke's ground cover and flocks, and I say that with absolutely no sponsorship or anything in it for me. They're just good. If you do want to use any of it yourself, there are links in the description, so check that out. I can highly recommend it. I hope this video gave you guys some ideas or inspiration for some multi-use scatter terrain. Whether you use it for D&D or Wargaming, it's often far more flexible than you first think. I'm constantly coming up with new ways to use this kind of stuff when I'm putting together dioramas or shots for the channel. As always, let me know in the comments what you like about the build, but also if you have any ideas of how you would change this for your own builds. If these videos are something you get something from and you enjoy them every week, the best way you can help me keep making them is by joining me in the archive on Patreon. By doing that, you gain access to some free printables to help make crafting easier, as well as a bit of a preview and vote on what projects that I do next. Like this one, for example. Most importantly though, you'll be helping me provide the community with more tutorials like this one. Sharing my videos to your friends and groups is also absolutely amazing, and I just want to take the time to thank you guys directly for any of you who've taken one of my videos and shared it with people. Finally, if you need any tools or supplies or any of the stuff that I use in these builds, check out the list in the description. It'll tell you everything that I use as well as where to pick it up, and there are some Amazon links in there that you can help support the channel with without spending an extra penny. It's all included in what you would usually spend. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next week with another interesting build. Until then, I'll be in the archive.